The first sign something was wrong wasn't the trucks. It was the confidence. I live on a ranch far enough from town that most people don't wander out here by accident. Long gravel drive. Locked gate. Faded sign warning about private property. Anyone who comes this far usually knows exactly where they're going, or exactly what they're trying to pull. That morning, I was repairing a fence line near the tree line when I heard engines rolling and slow, deliberate, like they wanted to be noticed. 2 black SUVs stopped just short of my gate. Doors opened in sync. 3 men stepped out wearing dark uniforms that tried very hard to look official.
Tried.
They had badges clipped to their belts, patches on their sleeves. One of them even adjusted his sunglasses like he'd practiced it in the mirror. Clipboard in hand, chest puffed out. The whole performance screamed authority cosplay. One of them called out my name. That's when I knew this wasn't random. They said they were HOA enforcement officers responding to violations on community-managed land. That alone was laughable. My ranch predates the nearest HOA by decades. No shared roads. No common areas. No overlap. Nothing. But they didn't ask questions. They issued orders. They told me I was being investigated for unauthorized structures, improper land use, and failure to comply with HOA governance. They said they needed access to inspect the property immediately. When I didn't move, one of them stepped closer and said the word they always use when intimidation is the goal. Detainment. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just watched them carefully. Years of training teach you something simple. Real authority doesn't need to announce itself this loudly. Real professionals don't rush. They don't threaten first. And they definitely don't use vague language to scare people into compliance. Ask them which HOA they represented. The man with the clipboard hesitated. Just half a second. Long enough. Then he named an association located miles away. Strike 1. I asked for jurisdiction documentation. Blank stare. Strike 2. Then I noticed the details most people miss. The stitching on the uniforms was cheap. The badges weren't standardized. One patch was crooked. Another used outdated terminology no legitimate agency would touch. Strike 3. They tried again, harder this time. Said refusing access would escalate consequences. Said law enforcement could be involved. Said my ranch might be seized under community enforcement authority. That's when I almost smiled. Because everything they were doing depended on one assumption, that I'd panic, argue, or submit. They had no idea who they were standing in front of. I told them calmly they were trespassing. I informed them the property was private, not subject to any HOA, and that they should leave immediately. They didn't. Instead, one of them reached for his radio and announced they were initiating a compliance procedure. That was the moment the situation stopped being ridiculous and became dangerous. Not because I was scared. Because pretending to be law enforcement crosses a line you can't uncross. I reached into my jacket, slow and deliberate, and told them to pay very close attention to what happened next. The confidence on their faces started to crack. They still thought this was their scene. They were wrong. Because the ranch wasn't theirs. The authority wasn't theirs. And the man they were trying to intimidate didn't learn discipline, patience, and consequences from an HOA rulebook. He learned it somewhere very different. And in the next moments, that difference was about to matter more than they could possibly imagine. The moment I revealed my background, the subtle shift was immediate, but the fake HOA officers didn't know how to handle it. I held up my credentials carefully. Not with arrogance, not with a flourish. Just enough to make the truth undeniable. The glint of the official seal on my ID caught the sunlight, and suddenly their composure faltered. What had been swagger and assumed control transformed into hesitation. The taller one took a half step back, and I could see his mind racing. Clipboard guy tried to act as if nothing had changed, but the trembling of his hands betrayed him. Their script had no response to someone with real authority, training, and the ability to act if they crossed the line. Sir, the taller one stammered, we were just following orders. Orders. The magic word people like them cling to when they know nothing else can justify the bluff. I leaned slightly, my tone calm but firm. Orders from whom? And under what lawful authority do you attempt to enforce these rules on my property? There was a pause, a split second long enough to feel like hours. Then another pause. They realized every statement they'd made was on record. Every threat, every claim of detainment, every violation notice. And all of it was baseless. Clipboard guy cleared his throat and said, "We can resolve this internally, without escalation." I tilted my head and let a small, controlled smile appear. Too late for internal resolution. You've already crossed the line into impersonating law enforcement and making threats. That's not internal. That's criminal. Their faces shifted from disbelief to panic. For the first time, I saw the full spectrum of their entitlement crumble. These weren't trained officers. They weren't prepared for confrontation. They were amateurs trying to wield imagined authority, and it was disintegrating around them in real time. "Leave my property now," I said, voice steady. "If you step foot on it again, law enforcement will be involved. And I promise, it will be a very different conversation next time." They tried one last week protest, mumbled something about community enforcement and fines, but the words were hollow. I could see them calculating escape routes in their heads, weighing which exit offered the least embarrassment. By the time they finally backed off the driveway, they were pale, shuffling, and muttering to themselves. Their SUVs sat awkwardly in the gravel, engines still running, waiting for permission that would never come. Across the street, a neighbor who had been watching discreetly clapped softly. Another started recording on their phone. The word spread almost immediately. Something had gone down at my ranch. I closed the door calmly, locked it, and reviewed the footage from my cameras. Every angle had captured them perfectly. Every step, every gesture, every fraudulent claim documented. This wasn't about humiliation. It wasn't about revenge. It was about preparation, proof, and control. I had neutralized their bluff without aggression, without yelling, and without making a spectacle of myself. But I knew the HOA president would react. They never failed to escalate when cornered. By the afternoon, my phone rang with an urgent email from the HOA president herself, demanding a meeting to clarify my property status and threatening action if I refused. That's when I smiled. Because retaliation from entitled people is predictable. And every move they made from here on out would be cataloged, documented, and used against them. By the next morning, it was obvious that the HOA president had started panicking. My inbox was flooded with emails, each more desperate than the last. Subject lines like urgent, property compliance issue, and final notice tried to convey authority, but the tone was all wrong, frantic, pleading, unconvincing. I didn't respond immediately. That's rule 1. Let entitled people reveal themselves fully. The longer they panic, the more of their own mistakes they expose. Then came the phone calls, one after another. Each HOA board member wanted to talk privately. They assumed their veneer of control was enough to intimidate me, that I would bend under the weight of their combined voices. Instead, I prepared. I gathered all the evidence. Property deeds, HOA maps showing boundaries, emails, screenshots of fake badges, and footage from the morning confrontation. Every detail meticulously labeled. Every fraudulent claim recorded. By the time the first real law enforcement officer arrived, I was ready. And I didn't even need to explain everything at once. Just enough to make the first point. They had no authority here. The officer listened patiently, asking questions, reviewing the evidence. Their calm professionalism highlighted the difference between real authority and the fake intimidation tactics the HOA had used. When I showed the footage of the fake officers threatening arrest, their eyebrows shot up. "This isn't just overreach," the officer muttered. "This is impersonation." Once the law enforcement officer left, word started spreading in the neighborhood. Social media posts appeared, neighbors whispered stories, and the HOA's power structure began to wobble. People who had been quietly compliant suddenly questioned every move. Emails, fines, and notices that once intimidated residents now sparked skepticism and debate. Then the inevitable call came from the HOA president herself. Her voice was sharp, defensive, and unconvincing. She tried to assert authority, claiming that I was in violation and that legal action would be taken. I let her speak for a moment, letting her frustration show. Then I calmly responded, "I'm not a member of your HOA. I never have been. And any further attempts to threaten or intimidate me will be documented and forwarded to proper authorities." There was silence on the line. The kind of silence that makes entitled people realize their control has evaporated. The rest of the day was a mix of relief and strategy. I documented every call, every email, every attempt to reassert authority. The HOA's credibility was eroding with each misstep, and I knew they'd continue trying, but each time they reached, they were only digging themselves deeper. By evening, the neighborhood was buzzing. People began sharing their own encounters, realizing a pattern of overreach and entitlement. The HOA president had underestimated not just me, but the vigilance of the community. By the next morning, the HOA's desperation had escalated in full view. Notices were plastered across my gate, mailbox, and even taped to my front door, threatening fines, towing, and community enforcement measures. The language was aggressive, the font large and intimidating, but the underlying authority? Non-existent. I collected every notice, laid them out on my kitchen table, and compared them to the property maps and deeds I had carefully assembled. My ranch clearly fell outside the HOA's boundaries. Every claim they had made was baseless, a bluff trying to mask incompetence and entitlement. That's when I made my move. I responded, not with threats, not with yelling, but with meticulous documentation. I emailed the entire HOA board, attaching plats, deeds, zoning overlays, and screenshots of the fake officers with time-stamped video evidence. I didn't editorialize. I didn't taunt. Facts alone were enough. The reaction was immediate. Board members began replying, trying to justify actions that were impossible to justify. One treasurer admitted she hadn't been properly informed. Another member resigned outright. A few forwarded internal emails that confirmed my property was never under HOA control. Word spread fast. Residents started questioning the legitimacy of fines, notices, and enforcement actions. Social media posts comparing my evidence to past HOA communications began circulating, painting a picture of systemic overreach and intimidation. The HOA president attempted damage control, claiming a third-party contractor had handled the enforcement and that the officers were independent. But the records and footage told a different story. Linda, the president, had orchestrated the entire operation. By mid-afternoon, the HOA website went offline. Board meetings were canceled. The bank froze the HOA's account pending review. Their attempt to assert power had backfired spectacularly. Actual law enforcement intervened next. Detectives reviewed my evidence, acknowledged the impersonation and harassment, and started formal procedures. Subpoenas were issued, bank records scrutinized, and emails examined. Every layer of their entitlement was revealed, leaving no room for excuses. The neighborhood watched as the organization that had once intimidated them dissolved piece by piece. Authority that had seemed unchallengeable collapsed under scrutiny and facts. Residents who had once been afraid to speak now spoke freely, sharing their experiences and holding the remaining board members accountable. By the end of the week, Linda's house had a for sale sign, and the remaining HOA members had either resigned or disappeared from public view. The organization was in shambles, all because they underestimated one homeowner who documented, questioned, and refused to be intimidated. The final chapter didn't arrive with a dramatic confrontation or shouting. It came quietly, through consequences that couldn't be ignored. A certified letter arrived in my mailbox from the county, outlining the investigation into impersonation of law enforcement, fraudulent enforcement actions, and misuse of HOA funds. It explicitly stated that the HOA had no authority to issue notices, collect fees, or take any enforcement action until the investigation concluded. The law had effectively neutralized their power. Within days, the neighborhood realized the shift. HOA signs vanished, notices stopped, and board members either resigned or went silent. People who had been timid and compliant finally walked freely on their own property without fear. The same streets that once felt tense and policed by imagined authority now felt open, calm, and safe. Linda, the HOA president, was gone. Her house had a for sale sign, and the remaining HOA leadership was scrambling to salvage what little credibility they had left. Social media buzzed with residents sharing their own stories, exposing a pattern of overreach, fake authority, and intimidation. The HOA's entire facade had crumbled. Legal action followed quietly but effectively. Subpoenas were served, bank records were scrutinized, and the fake officer operation was exposed. Every step they had taken to intimidate or control residents was now documented evidence against them. Fraudulent enforcement notices, fake badges, and fabricated fines became a case study in entitlement collapsing under accountability. I didn't need to retaliate with force. I didn't need theatrics. The system worked because I had the patience, documentation, and willingness to let the truth unfold. Entitled people survive by assuming others won't question them, won't check the facts, won't stand firm. I did all three, and the results were absolute. The neighborhood transformed. Residents attended meetings, questioned authority, and verified actions instead of blindly complying. People learned that intimidation only works until someone challenges it. As for me, life returned to normal. Peaceful mornings, quiet evenings, and the satisfaction of knowing that entitlement can be defeated without escalating chaos. Every so often, a new resident asks about the old HOA. I smile and say simply, there used to be one. It didn't last. Because entitlement only thrives in silence, and once it is confronted with facts, patience, and authority rooted in truth, it collapses under its own weight. Linda thought authority was something you could fake. She learned, the hard way, that real authority doesn't rely on costumes or threats. It relies on law, preparation, and accountability. And once those things show up, there's nowhere left to hide.